Our panel today is the Iraq War as History, a roundtable discussion. We have a wonderful panel. If you were hoping to hear Sinan Antoon, he is unable to be with us. And Dina R Khoury is Associate Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. Since 2007, she has been researching and writing on war and memory. Her research has been funded by the Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Her forthcoming book, coming out in February, is Iraq in Wartime, Soldiering, Martyring, and Remembrance with Cambridge University Press. It draws upon documents and interviews to argue that war was a form of everyday bureaucratic governance that transforms the manner in which Iraqis made claims to citizenship and expressed notions of selfhood. Melvyn Leffler is Edward Stettinius Professor of American History at the University of Virginia and a faculty fellow in the Governing America in a Global Era program at UVA's Miller Center. His essential work on the Cold War includes the prize-winning books For the Soul of Mankind, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, and A Preponderance of Power, National Security, the Truman Administration, and the Cold War. He has been president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, which very sadly is having their lunch right now. So we could reconvene upstairs and gather some dessert. He has been president of the, he has received fellowships from many wonderful places, including the Council of Foreign Relations, the United States Institute of Peace, the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. He's now working on the foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration. Peter Mansoor became the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at The Ohio State University in 2008 upon retirement as colonel from a 26-year career in the U.S. Army. He served 2 combat tours in Iraq, commanding the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division in Baghdad and Karbala in 2003 and 2004, and serving as executive officer to General David Petraeus, the commanding general of multinational forces Iraq, in 2007 and 2008. Dr. Mansoor is the author of a prize-winning memoir on the Iraq War, Baghdad at Sunrise, a brigade commander's war in Iraq, published by Yale University Press. A forthcoming second memoir, also with Yale, is Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus, and the remaking of the Iraq War. So Dina.
Okay. Thank you, Mary, for this introduction. I'm here to speak to you today as a historian of Iraq, although I can't say that I'm speaking from an Iraqi perspective or the perspective of Iraq. I'm just a historian, and this is my assessment of whether the Iraq War is history. My book, which Mary has so kindly described, is based on Iraqi documents, Iraqi government documents, but also on oral interviews with Iraqi soldiers and intellectuals who fought in the Iran-Iraq War and the first Gulf War. What I found striking in my research is that most of the Iraqis I interviewed thought of the American war in Iraq as something that started with the first Gulf War and continued through the sanctions. Most spoke about that war in apocalyptic terms, alluding to the level of destruction brought on by the military technologies deployed by the war, that is to say the first Gulf War, and the sense of complete collapse of the world as they knew it in the decade that followed the first Gulf War. It is with this sense of rupture in their lives, as well as the insistence that there is a continuum between the 1991 and 2003 wars, in mind, that I'll spend the 15 or 20 minutes allotted to me to widen our discussion of the war on Iraq to include the first Gulf War and the sanctions regime. Granted, the invasion of Iraq and its occupation fundamentally transformed Iraq. Perhaps the most significant is that it unleashed unparalleled violence in a society that had experienced war and regime violence since 1980. It permanently undermined central state structures, brought in an elite with dubious commitments to building national consensus and a pluralistic society, and established an economic order that opened up Iraq to the unfettered and unregulated capitalist investment. But the occupation and the political elite that it helped bring to power worked in a social and political environment that also shaped the way they governed. There are others on the panel, my colleagues on the panel will speak with more authority on the question from the US perspective. My interest today is to talk to you about the 1991-2003 period as an incubator of several developments that were magnified with the 2003 invasion. And I want to focus particularly on state structures, on social humanitarian impact, and sectarian politics. Let me begin with the question of state structures. One of the criticisms leveled against the US occupation authority, the Coalition Provisional Authority, or the CPA, is that it dismantles state structures and the armed forces, thus depriving itself and the future governments of Iraq of the instruments of stable rule. There's truth to this argument, of course, but it's only partial. The dismantling of state structures, the hollowing out of Iraqi institutions, the decentralization of power, and the regionalism of Iraq was as much a result of the first Gulf War and the sanctions regime as it was the result of blinkered policies of the CPA, now widely criticized. So the sanctions imposed by the UN and aggressively implemented by the Security Council, dominated by the US agenda, have been called by political scientist and legal scholar Joy Gordon an invisible war. Not only was the US attempting regime change through sanctioning the Iraqi population, the sanctions depleted state resources. The curtailment of the political, territorial, and economic integrity of the state had, of course, far-reaching implications. From a relatively efficient welfare state, the Iraqi government became a dysfunctional shadow of itself. The regime's primary concern was, of course, its own survival. What was the most important for it was that the decision-making processes over the disbursement of scarce resources were now diverted from a relatively stable channels of funding through ministries and state institutions to the office of the presidency. Controlled by Saddam Hussein and a narrow circle of loyalists, the office's main sources of revenue were through illicit trade and the doling out primarily of contracts to favored supporters. A rapid privatization of state resources marked by corruption and personalization of access depleted these institutions. We've seen this, of course, happen in the 1990s in many post-colonial welfare state systems in Africa and the Middle East, and iteration that's quite problematic of neoliberal economic policies in autocratic and highly militarized societies. But what was unique, I think, in the Iraqi case was that privatization took place under an aggressive embargo and continued military strikes. It was shaped thus not by the management of markets, but by severe restrictions on markets. What was most important in this context was the biological, of course, survival of a population at a minimal level. The Iraqi government was systematically denied the resources to build state structures that could allow it to educate its citizens, build up health and human services, and altogether maintain its services at pre-1990 levels. Now, the result of this privatization is that as a result, this privatization was accompanied by massive pauperization of populations and the complete rather than gradual dismantlement of the welfare state. Only one ministry, the Ministry of Trade, ran effectively in large part because it was responsible for the disbursement of rations, and after 1996 it ran the oil for food program. Other ministries such as that of Industries, Public Works, and so on were strategically rated for the regime, for the technocrats. It could provide for the modest rebuilding efforts that the Ba'ath regime undertook. So that state institutions, the basic structure of a welfare state, were hollowed out well before the 2003 invasion. When the US went into Iraq, it embraced too often incoherently articulated and implemented policies when it came to institution building. The first was destructive. The de-Baathification of state institutions, most importantly the army and security services. And the second sought to rebuild institutions through a private-public sector partnership. The results were less than promising. Rather than streamline and modernize debilitated structures, the result was the creation of a kleptocratic state that put the one that was run by Saddam Hussein to shame. De-Baathification not only did away with the cadre of bureaucrats who had most expertise, it also became a venue for settling scores and creating a primarily ethnic sectarian state in Iraq. And I think part of the problem was a basic misunderstanding of how radically changed the political terrain of Iraq had become in the 1990s. A change brought on in no small measure by the persistence, I think, of wartime conditions in the 90s, even though it was supposed to be peace and this is a sanctions period. So I want to speak briefly to the most controversial and ultimately most political of these problems, which is the issue of de-Baathification. The US occupation brought with it a slew of Iraqi opposition parties, secular and Islamists, who had had a history of persecution by the Ba'athist regime. So they were bent on cleansing the Ba'athists from all government institutions. Most of their politics were shaped, however, by their experience of the Ba'ath in the 70s and 80s. They had little familiarity with the Ba'ath and how much it had changed in the 90s. In particular, the exiled Shia Islamist parties had operated from Iran and had fought along the Iranian regime in the long Iran-Iraq war. The secular parties had been exiled for some time, and their understanding was of the Ba'ath was based on 1970s and their experience in the 1970s. But the Ba'ath had changed radically in the 1990s. It had more than doubled in membership numbers between the late 1980s and 2002, but it had lost at the same time a great deal of its power and importance in the political terrain of Iraq. To make sense of this apparent contradiction between increase in numbers and diluted political significance, we need to understand one central component of Iraqi politics in the last 12 years of Ba'athist rule. That the regime and the party were greatly weakened by the first Gulf War and the embargo. They were strong enough to stay in power, but too weak to establish sovereignty, let alone hegemony, over all Iraqi territory, including the South, and to maintain funding for entitlements programs that had helped bolster its support in the 1980s. So the regime had to improvise, thinking strategically and often haphazardly of ways to allocate its political and economic resources to buy the obedience of its population and to create the illusion of durability. Two phrases perhaps describe its policy: privatization of security and politics and the dispersal of control. It's with that in mind that it devised several strategies. It encouraged the expansion of the Ba'ath party by recruiting widely and promoting within its ranks without requisite years of experience, so that by the time the US invasion took place, membership and leadership within the party had much less to do with experience and ideological commitment, and more to do with the ability to recruit members and mobilize populations for the tremendously numerous celebrations and that the regime put on and to maintain security. Membership was also quite episodic. People would join and then drop off. They would join after recruitment attempts and then disappear. And more importantly, Ba'athists were Sunnis and Shias. Thus, the process of de-Baathification, if it were to take place in any meaningful way, had to be sect blind, something neither the political leadership of the post-2003 nor the American occupying forces initially could understand. But the Ba'ath was no longer also the most important and main player in the political field. Tribal leaders, both Sunnis and Shias, were now given weapons weapons and land if they proved loyal. They were given some control over territories in central and southern Iraq. They took over a number of state institutional functions. And of course, they became security entrepreneurs, i.e. this was basically, they were armed and were responsible for the areas that came under their control. And these were tribesmen that were not tribesmen with tents. It's very important to remember this. They were quite, many of them were professionals, they were doctors, merchants, but it becomes much more expedient and profitable to use the regime's policy of using tribes for them. So they identify that suddenly the tribal leadership becomes more important. Even within the military, the Ba'ath Party was no longer as important as it was before. Both the Ministry of Defense and the military office of the party had to compete for resources with other paramilitary organizations set up by Saddam's son. So the decision to de-Ba'athify state institutions was disastrous, not only because it destroyed the already weakened structures of the Iraqi state, but because it accelerated the process of privatization and dispersal of power that had begun in the 1990s. More importantly, it ultimately was quite selective and has become right now a form of punishment of Sunnis who are now regarded as the only Ba'athists, although there were equal number of Ba'athists in the 90s in Shi'i areas as they were in Sunni areas of Iraq. Now, I'm not going to speak much about the embargo because of lack of time, but it's important to stress the fact that the embargo was, the sanctions were debilitating to Iraqi society, which depended on its needs for about 75% of imports were to feed its population. So state institutions, education, health structures, all of that were much weakened and underfunded. And the result of all of that was a spike in crime, underemployment, delinquency, and poverty. And the per capita income of Iraqis dropped from 3,500 in the pre-war period to 475 in 1996. And I think Joy Gordon, again, whose book is wonderful, has written on the ethical and moral implications of the sanctions as a form of collective punishment and the role of the US in it. But what this meant for the occupation and the governments that were set up in the wake of that occupation was that the Americans, as well as the Iraqi government, encountered a population debilitated by poverty, severe health problems, and a host of social problems, frankly, that needed to be dealt with before issues of democratization and nation building took place. It was a huge social problem that needed to be dealt with directly. And of course, there's the fallout from the occupation, which is the huge dispersal of Iraqi populations. We have 3 million Iraqis that are either dispersed outside of Iraq or internally displaced in Iraq. Finally, before I conclude, I want to speak to one of the most salient problems that has emerged with the American occupation of Iraq, which is the issue of sectarianism. Analysts and critics of the American occupation have argued that the political system set up by the occupying forces and enshrined eventually in the Constitution set up really an ethno-sectarian state in which power was apportioned along ethno-sectarian lines. Critics of the occupation have often argued that whatever one can say about the Ba'ath, and you could say a large number of bad things about it, its ideology was sect-blind, and that sectarianism was new to Iraqi politics. Others also have argued that while the Ba'athist policies favored Sunnis, the solution to this problem was not to create a political system in which sect becomes the defining feature of access and entitlements. At the same time, critics of the occupation have also pointed out that the policies of the Americans and their Iraqi allies have helped reinforce tribalism and regionalism rather than integrate Iraq around a strong centralized state. I'd like to complicate this rather schematic view of Iraqi politics. I think the sectarianism ultimately enshrined in the way the constitution was structured of Iraq and practiced by its political elite is new. That is to say, the systematic institutionalization of sectarianism in the parliament, in state institutions, and sanctioned by the legal apparatus of de-Baathification in post-2000 is a post-2003 phenomenon. What is new as well is the open espousal of sectarian identity politics in public culture. Until 2003, sectarianism was, in the words of an Iraqi intellectual I spoke to, a hidden discourse in Iraq. That's not to say, however, that the Ba'athist regime did not practice sectarian politics. These, however, were informed not by a sectarian political and cultural discourse, but by the question of security. The primary concern of the Ba'athist regime was obedience of its population. To put it a bit facetiously, it was an equal opportunity oppressor. Despite this, however, the Shi'is, particularly after the Shia-dominated uprising in 1991, were targeted for surveillance and punishment. Not all Shi'is suffered, however, as a substantial portion of them remained Ba'athists, and there were Shi'i tribes who supported the regime in the south. Thus, while the Ba'athist regime practiced sectarian policies and targeted Shi'i populations for punishments, its main concern was to weed out obedient Shi'is from insurgent Shi'is. It was, in other words, fully cognizant of the complexity of Shi'i allegiances. So the current political elite is not redressing grievances of all Shi'is who had been historically oppressed by all Sunni Ba'athists. Rather, what they have done, with the help of the US, is enshrine a political order that elides the complexity of their communal history and twins Iraqi patriotism to Shi'i resistance to Sunni-dominated Ba'athist rule. It's a very selective reading of Iraqi and communal history. Okay, so I'd like to conclude. I had begun my comments by reminding us of seeing the Iraq War not as one that started 10 years ago, but one that has been taking place since 1991. And I had called for the consideration of the embargo well and the surgical strikes as a form of war as well, as a continuation of war. The question that this roundtable asks is whether the Iraq War is history, i.e. is it over? Certainly from the perspective of the Iraqis, it's not over. The war, all 22 years of it, is certainly not over. But I think the question posed in this roundtable has another component that is worth exploring further, and I'm not sure how to explore it. Where do populations in countries like Iraq, now Syria, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, fall in the story we tell about the evolution of new forms of international control and new visions of viable and acceptable states? I've spent the last 2 days, as many of you perhaps have, going to sessions on decolonization. And I'm struck by a question I can't seem to answer. Is colonization and decolonization history? And I'm reminded of a little booklet that the late Iraqi Saudi intellectual Abdul Rahman al-Munif put together in April 2003, just after the occupation of Iraq, entitled Iraq, Notes on the Margins of History and Resistance. It's a compilation of essays on British colonial officers, Iraqi rebels, and nationalist leaders, and a not too subtle reminder that the US was another colonial power. In his words, the presence of historical memory is both an education and a call to action. This appeal to memory of a colonial past is not unique in the among Iraqi Arab or Arab nationalists. See, it's also mirrored by the US policymakers and commentators. I'm not sure how many of you remember how popular Gertrude Bell all of a sudden became after 2003, and how often the British policies towards the Iraqi populations were invoked by policy analysts, the media, as well as historians in the wake of the 2003 occupation. And I think I'll end on that note.
I think that was a terrific paper. I really learned a lot from it. Thank you. My focus today is on the U.S. decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. And basically, I'm addressing the question of can we study this aspect of the Iraq War as history, this very specific, narrow aspect of why the United States went to war. I'd say that historians should try to do so, but I think we face formidable obstacles regarding evidence. It's like writing about the origins of the Cold War in 1955, or writing about Wilson's decisions to go to war and to make peace in the late 1920s. So we need to have this perspective in mind. Historians still have very few archival records, but we do have a growing memoir literature, including some declassified documents put on the websites by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith in conjunction with the publication of the books. We also have policymakers' comments in congressional testimony, as well as several excellent commission and committee reports, including those by the 9/11 Commission, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Iraq Survey Group. The National Security Archive has done a very good job filing FOIA requests and putting documents on their website as electronic briefing books. In his own book, 500 Days, Kurt Eichenwald shows how documents submitted in court cases can be extraordinarily illuminating. We also now have the captured Iraqi records, or at least some of them, which are housed at the Conflict Records Center at the National Defense University, including many documents, but of course just a small portion, from the Iraqi Intelligence Service, and also some tapes of Saddam Hussein's conversations. Yes, Saddam also taped his conversations, or at least some of them. And finally, the British inquiry on Iraq, known as the Chilcot Inquiry, has spectacularly good interviews with every important British official, along with many key documents. Although we don't have any systematic American archival evidence, I do believe that the growing body of evidence that we do have enables us to step back and problematize some key matters that merit the close attention of historians as more and more of us focus on the Iraq War as history. Let me briefly highlight some of these questions that I think invite closer scrutiny. First, was going to war predetermined? Many observers think it was, and many writers claim that the decision for war in 2003 was shaped by the predispositions of neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz, who were long-term proponents of regime change, and who allegedly were motivated by a desire to democratize and transform the Middle East. Yet the documents and the memoirs that now have become available indicate that Iraq was not a high priority on the high priority list of President Bush before 9/11, nor high on the priority list of any of the so-called principal decision makers, Powell, Rumsfeld, Cheney, or Rice, prior to 9/11. Yes, there were many discussions of Iraq, but mostly focused on what to do with the eroding regime of sanctions and with the enforcement of no-fly zones. There was some focus on regime change, but a negligible amount on democracy promotion. And in any case, nothing was decided prior to 9/11. War plans were not being worked on and revised. Everyone did want regime change. After all, this was a legacy of the Clinton era. But Bush's advisors acknowledged there were no good options. In brief, policy actually was adrift. So if the war in Iraq in 2003 was not predetermined, and if 9/11 was transformative with regard to policy toward Iraq, a key issue for historians to examine is whether Saddam was or was not contained. Secretary of State Powell thought he was contained. So did Hugh Shelton, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Before 9/11, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency reported that Saddam's military capabilities had been seriously degraded since 1991. Moreover, we now know that he possessed no weapons of mass destruction. So it seems that Saddam was contained. But in the fall of 2001 and early 2002, many key officials in the government did not think he was contained. For example, the new incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Myers, as well as Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney. So, key question, was Saddam contained? Interestingly, David Kay and Charles Leffler, both of whom led the Iraq Survey Group, which determined that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, nonetheless concluded that Saddam was not contained. They argued that sanctions were eroding, that Saddam knew sanctions were eroding, that Saddam was aggregating huge sums of money from violating the oil for food regime and rapidly building up his conventional capabilities and preparing to reactivate his weapons of mass destruction programs as soon as he would be able to. For example, Leffler's commission points out that the overall military-industrial budget of Saddam Hussein increased 40-fold between 1998 and 2003. Captured Iraqi documents in Saddam's own conversations and interviews confirm that he had every intention of breaking free of sanctions, reconstituting his military strength, returning to work on WMD, and seeking to assert regional hegemony. So, was Saddam contained? Was there reason to worry about his intentions and capabilities? The answers to these questions depend on how one evaluates and how policymakers at the time evaluated whether there were links between Saddam, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. Was it reasonable to think that Saddam had such links? Richard Clarke, Paul Pillar, and other analysts said that there were no links between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. Experts have turned up no evidence linking Saddam to 9/11, no evidence showing that Saddam had any operational control over Al-Qaeda. But policymakers in their memoirs argue that framing the question this way is a red herring. They say they were not so much concerned with Saddam's links to 9/11, or even they were not so concerned with Saddam's links to 9/11, or even his links to Al-Qaeda, as officials were concerned about thwarting another terrorist attack. In other words, in their view, Iraq was an integral part of the global war on terror, the principal objective of which was to prevent another attack on America, Americans, or America's friends and allies. If this framing of the issue is true, then historians need to study this matter and assess whether the concerns of policymakers were justified. The CIA found that there were no operational ties between Al-Qaeda and Saddam. But when the agency's analysts looked more closely at the issue in mid-2002, they concluded that Saddam was linked to many terrorist groups and that he did provide training, safe haven, and information to Al-Qaeda, although there were no operational ties and no direction. Captured Iraqi documents shed some light on these matters now. There's no smoking gun clarifying the matter. But the editors of the Iraqi documents and translators studying them report that after 1991, Saddam increased his cooperation and attempts to manipulate Islamic fundamentalists and related terrorist organizations. He was, and I'm quoting, willing to co-opt or support organizations that he knew to be part of Al-Qaeda, as long as that organization's near-term goals supported Saddam's long-term vision. Captured Iraqi documents show that Iraqi terrorist acts took place in London, Iran, the Kurdish areas of Iraq, Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, and the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. The Iraqi intelligence service had collaborations and interactions with the Abu Nidal organization, Hamas, the PLF, Afghan Islamic Party, Egypt Islamic Jihad, and other little-known terrorist organizations. The Iraqi documents reveal, in the words of the editors of their documents, that Saddam regarded suicide missions, quote, as routine state activity, end quote. So a key question for historians to study is whether these links played a key role in the decision to go to war. Did these links motivate the desire to go to war? The answer may depend on the assessment of whether it made sense to think that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Clearly, the overriding fear of proponents of war was that Saddam would hand off weapons of mass destruction or information about weapons of mass destruction to terrorists who might seek to inflict harm on Americans or the United States or its allies and friends. Writers have spent a lot of time showing that top administration officials manipulated, exaggerated, and lied about the evidence of weapons of mass destruction. They did. But the more important question is whether they believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And why did they believe it? The memoir literature and the documents seem to confirm that almost all, in fact, I would say all administration officials sincerely believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, especially, and the focus was on chemical and biological weapons. Even the critics of the decision to go to war with Saddam agreed that they thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Richard Haas, the State Department head of the Policy Planning Office and a leading critic of the war, thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. So did Clark, the counterterrorist expert. So did Paul Pillar, the high CIA official. So did Charles Leffler and David Kay. So did Joseph Wilson. All of them thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. Why did they think so? Did intelligence officers, did intelligence analysts in the United States provide incorrect information and misleading judgments to policymakers because they were pressured to do so? On this, there are violent disagreements amongst top intelligence officials themselves. Paul Pillar, a high-ranking CIA official, says yes, they were pressured. Carl Ford, the head of State Department intelligence, says no, they were not pressured. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence examined this matter very carefully and said no, there was no political pressure. Some scholars have looked at the matter and argued yes, there was pressure. Two leading scholars, Bob Jervis and Dick Betts, acknowledge that intelligence analysts made huge errors, but they do not attribute the errors to political pressure. After all, even Saddam's closest associates thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And many inquiries have shown that Saddam carefully orchestrated this perception. So, a question remains. Was it reasonable to think that Saddam had WMD? Clearly, historians have much to sort out on this matter. If officials thought that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, as they did, and if they thought he had links to terrorist groups, did policymakers ponder options besides war? Officials say their war planning and deployments were linked to coercive diplomacy, not to their desire to go to war. And in fact, most observers at the time did believe that Saddam would only respond or capitulate to military pressure. US officials, therefore, had reason to deploy forces in order to get Saddam to comply with UN resolutions and to get inspectors back into Iraq. But the question remains, did they really practice coercive diplomacy? Historians need to explore this key question more carefully. Did war come because officials wanted it, or because coercive diplomacy did not work, or perhaps because coercive diplomacy could not work and shouldn't have been tried? If officials desired war, or if they believed, as they argue in their memoirs, that US credibility was vested in a policy of coercive diplomacy that was, in their own view, failing, why then did they plan so poorly for post-war reconstruction? We now know that some military planners, as well as intelligence and State Department experts, foresaw possibilities of post-war havoc and civil strife. Why were they ignored? Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of State, and others who have written memoirs claim that these experts actually were not ignored. They stressed that they did plan for humanitarian assistance, a refugee crisis, and conflagrations in the oil fields, events that did not occur, they argue, because of their careful military planning. They acknowledge, however, that they underestimated the number of troops needed for security, and that they underestimated how depleted the infrastructure was. But it's not at all clear why they should have underestimated these things. After all, they do seem to have been warned about these very matters. There are several possible explanations. Perhaps officials were too boldly wed to showing the efficacy of military transformation, or possibly too eager to deploy troops to yet other locations, or after the apparent success in Afghanistan, overconfident about a swift transition of authority to Iraqis themselves, or too enamored by their distorted memory of developments in Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall came down. Perhaps most of all, they avoided dwelling on ominous post-war scenarios, lest exploration of such matters catalyze opposition to the war itself. In short, we need to explain why planning was so bad, and we need to ponder whether better planning and more troops would have made a difference in policymakers' calculations for war and in their handling of the war's aftermath. What seems clear is that there was no focused debate amongst the top policymakers of the pros and cons of going to war. Yes, Rumsfeld presented a, quote, list of horribles to the National Security Council principals, terrible things that might occur. And Secretary of State Powell warned Bush that he would have to live with broken pottery. But there does not seem to have been a real effort at the highest levels to examine whether the risks of living with Saddam outweighed the risks of going to war, even though such matters were being debated and studied at lower levels of the administration. So another key issue for historians to investigate is why the decision-making process was so flawed. So far, no clear answer to this question, in my opinion, has emerged. Although, revealingly, most of the top decision makers in their memoirs provide ample testimony that they knew there were real problems in the decision-making process, perhaps precipitated by the peculiar personalities and interactions of the principals themselves, Bush, Cheney, Rice, Powell, and Rumsfeld. I suspect that this conundrum about the durability of a flawed process may lead historians to want to investigate more carefully the role of Bush himself. He could have made the process operate more efficiently. He was aware of the difficulties. He was aware of the feuding, but he seemed content to live with the process. Why was that the case? Perhaps because the process maximized his own flexibility, a flexibility that had devastating consequences, especially when he appointed Paul Bremer as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, gave Bremer broad authority, and allowed Bremer to reverse the plans that his own defense officials had been proposing for the last 6 months and that Bush himself previously had approved. In regard to these issues, careful institutional and bureaucratic histories might help us better grasp the gaps between the conceptualization of policy and the implementation of policy. In conclusion then, historians have much work to do. Why did top officials go to war? Did their preoccupation with Saddam make sense? Did they have better options than going to war? If they felt they didn't have better options, why did they prepare so badly for the post-war situation? Why were there so many feuds and such poor coordination at the highest levels of the Bush administration? As new documents become available and as we re-examine existing evidence, historians will need to grapple with the many baffling questions that surround the tragedy of the Iraq War. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to congratulate my fellow panelists, Dina and Melvyn, for outstanding papers. And I don't think this is going to work out, or could work out any better, since Dina covered pretty much before the war and Melvyn talked about 2003, and my focus is going to be on the surge and what came after. So historically or chronologically, we work out real well. The Iraq War, as part of the larger global war on terror, dominated the foreign policy of the two-term Bush administration. It had an undeniable impact on the U.S. standing in the world, on the expansion of Iranian power in the Middle East, and on the growth of the U.S. debt, not to mention the lives of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines sent overseas to wage it. The war's impact continues to reverberate across the Middle East today. The conflict in Iraq was a war of choice begun badly for vague strategic reasons and nearly lost. Indeed, President Bush would have done well to study more history before engaging in a war of choice in Iraq. War has always been an uncertain undertaking, and the most skillful diplomats and power brokers have worked hard to steer clear of it. Just because the U.S. armed forces are the most capable in the world today does not mean they should be the first choice for policymakers looking for solutions to difficult problems. The Bush administration's emphasis on military power over an understanding of the realities of war and conflict unfortunately reflect the ahistoricism of not only of too many policymakers, but of the American educational system as well. Present company accepted, of course. Our mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan were the result of a pervasive failure to understand the historical framework within which insurgencies take place, to appreciate the cultural and political factors of other nations and people, and to encourage the learning of other languages. In other words, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we managed to repeat many of the mistakes that we made in Vietnam because America's political and military leaders managed to forget nearly every lesson of that conflict. The Iraq War was, in many respects, a disaster for the Iraqi people. more than 116,000 of whom died in the ensuing hostilities. It also cost the lives of nearly 5,000 US soldiers, with tens of thousands more wounded physically or impacted mentally. But just because a war begins badly does not mean it has to end in tragedy. Or, as counterinsurgency expert David Kilcullen once noted, just because you invade a place stupidly doesn't mean you have to leave it stupidly. By the end of 2006, Iraq was coming apart along ethno-sectarian fault lines. Its dissolution would have jeopardized the stability of the entire Middle East, an area of much greater strategic concern to the United States and the West than Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda in Iraq would have gained a safe haven from which to inject its deadly brand of terror into neighboring states. Iran would have gained a position of semi-hegemony in the Middle East. The risk premium built into every barrel of oil shipped out of the Gulf would have risen by an order of magnitude. Wringing our hands about the flawed decision to invade Iraq was an interesting academic exercise and a convenient political foil, but it had zero utility in the real world of policy formulation in late 2006. In my view, surging US forces to Iraq in an attempt to reverse the declining fortunes of the coalition and its Iraqi partners was the right decision, even if it was merely the best of a lot of bad options. The successful outcome of the surge, in my view at any rate, offered Iraqi elites the opportunity, if not the certainty, to secure a peaceful future for themselves and their posterity, and in the process solidified a major strategic setback for Al-Qaeda that tarnished its brand worldwide. In their landmark study of military effectiveness from 1914 to 1945, historians Alan Millett and Williamson Murray conclude, no amount of operational virtuosity or strategic wisdom redeemed fundamental flaws in political and strategic judgment. Whether policy shaped strategy or strategic imperatives drove policy was irrelevant. Miscalculations in both led to defeat, and any combination of political strategic error had disastrous results, even for some nations that ended the war as members of the victorious coalitions. Even the effective mobilization of national will, manpower, industrial might, national wealth, and technological know-how did not save the belligerents from reaping the bitter fruit of severe mistakes at the strategic level. This is because it is more important to make correct decisions at the political and strategic level than it is at the operational and tactical levels. Mistakes in operations and tactics can be corrected, but political and strategic mistakes live on forever. In this sense, the surge saved the United States from a strategic predicament it should never have gotten into. President Bush would have been better served if the intense probing and debates surrounding the surge strategy in 2006 had instead occurred during the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Strategic consensus should be the result of vigorous debate, which serves to sharpen the assumptions upon which various courses of action rest, test their viability, and lay out what could go wrong. Such debate did not occur until far too late in the war. I believe historians will come to view the Bush presidency from 2006 to 2008 differently from the first 6 years of the administration. Only after President Bush decided to overrule the advice of his commander on the ground, and most of those in the Pentagon and the White House as well, did he find a way to a sound strategy that could achieve some measure of success. The Iraq War has spawned intense debate within the US military as well on the effectiveness and strategic suitability of counterinsurgency warfare. This is a debate worth having. But we must remember that in our constitutional system, it is civilian policymakers that ultimately determine where and when our armed forces will be sent to war. And if in the future the President and Congress commit US forces to another large stability operation, then the armed forces must be ready to engage in counterinsurgency warfare, however distasteful it might be. The alternative, to throw away the lessons of the past decade as the US Army literally did after Vietnam, is unacceptable. Iraq could still implode now or in the future, but it would do so under far different strategic conditions than those that prevailed in 2006. Although Iraq seems at the moment to be headed towards dictatorship, the tides of history wash in strange directions. The effects of the Arab Spring and other social currents in the Arab world, most notably the civil war in Syria, will undoubtedly influence the future of Iraq as well. The withdrawal of the last U.S. forces from Iraq at the end of December 2011 may have ended the Iraq War as far as the United States is concerned, but the job of historians in sorting out the various facets of the conflict is just beginning. This work is made much more difficult by the ongoing war in Afghanistan, which colors much of what has been reported on Iraq recently. Nevertheless, some excellent work is being written today by journalists and historians on the history of the Iraq War, despite the lack of complete documentary evidence and, as importantly, a strong Iraqi voice in the history of the conflict. The first wave of Iraq War history, the work of journalists and some participants, has already been published. The surge of U.S. forces into Iraq in 2007 and 2008, in particular, has been the focus of a number of books, such as The War Within by Bob Woodward, The Gamble by Tom Ricks, Tell Me How This Ends by Linda Robinson, The Strongest Tribe by Britt Bing West, and the recently published and very excellent The Endgame by Michael Gordon and Bernard Traynor. These works, some better than others, have one thing in common. They were all written by journalists looking from the outside of the institution, looking inward. The memoirs of such participants as Jerry Bremer, Donald Rumsfeld, Douglas Feith, General Tommy Franks, and Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez have proven to be more self-serving than illuminating. On the other hand, I believe President Bush's memoirs, Decision Points, and the recently published monograph by General George Casey, Strategic Reflections, approach matters with greater honesty and therefore have more merit. I hope my own forthcoming memoir, the second I have published or will have published on the Iraq War, will add to this growing body of literature. In the summer of 2008, I retired from the U.S. Army to enter academia as the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at The Ohio State University. I had just finished my second extended combat tour in Iraq, the last one a 15-month stint as Executive Officer to General David Petraeus. Yale University Press had just published my first memoir, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, on my command of a brigade combat team in Baghdad and Karbala in 2003 and 2004. Although I was tempted then to write an account of what had transpired during my second tour in Iraq, I knew the time was not yet right. The nation needed more distance from the events in question to provide proper perspective on them. More importantly, I was determined to wait until the primary sources that our staff had assembled for General Petraeus in Iraq were declassified and made accessible to historians. I moved on to other projects. 2 summers later, I attended a conference that examined the war in Afghanistan and what could be done to turn around the situation there, or if it were even possible to do so. The attendees were a veritable who's who of counterinsurgency experts in the world today. As the day wore on, the discussion invariably turned to the surge in Iraq and its applicability to the war in Afghanistan. Among other issues, the participants wrestled with whether it was necessary for a counterinsurgent force to protect the population in order to safeguard the people from insurgent intimidation and violence, or whether a counter-terrorist campaign of drone strikes and night raids could disable an insurgency with minimal help from conventional forces. The use of the Iraq analogy was not surprising, but the lack of insight among the participants into what made the surge in Iraq work was truly astonishing. They all thought they knew, but like the old joke of several blind men describing an elephant, each person had only a partial understanding of events. Here were the foremost experts in counterinsurgency warfare in the United States, I thought, and not one of them had the holistic insight to understand why the war in Iraq turned out as it did. I resolved at that moment to write a book on the surge in Iraq. Now, I was both an observer and a participant in the events leading up to the adoption of the surge strategy in 2006 and its subsequent implementation in 2007 and 2008. As a member of the Council of Colonels that assisted the Joint Chiefs of Staff in rethinking the strategy for the Iraq War, I had an intimate look at the deliberations that resulted in the adoption of the surge by the Bush administration. My subsequent assignment as Executive Officer to General David Petraeus provided me unparalleled access during the execution of the surge strategy in Iraq. I sat in on the fringes of most of the key meetings between administration officials and General Petraeus and participated in all of the important gatherings of military officers in multinational force Iraq. My notes and recollected insights from these events have provided a strong foundation for a comprehensive account of this period in history. Furthermore, I requested the declassification of certain records from General Petraeus' personal papers stored at the National Defense University, a request that was granted. These papers, along with the declassified documents in the General George Casey papers at the National Defense University, have proven most helpful in documenting the history of the war. Last month, I finished a manuscript on the history of the surge, which is now at the Pentagon for declassification review. In fact, the same person working on my memoir is the one who recently declassified General McChrystal's recently published memoirs. If all goes well, Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War will be published in September by Yale University Press. In it, I attempt to explain how those of us on the ground and in the halls of government tried to salvage U.S. national security objectives in Iraq, given the dire situation as it existed at the end of 2006. In his history of the surge, The Gamble, Tom Ricks writes, "The events for which the Iraq War will be remembered probably have not yet happened. The same could be said of the history of that war as well. The definitive history of the Iraq War is most likely several decades in the future. Today, only the rough shape of its outline is becoming clearer. I would like to think that my forthcoming history of the surge will contribute to that history, but I am positive that it will not be the last word on the subject. Nevertheless, I hope its contribution will be enduring, and in the end, perhaps that as much as a historian and a participant in the events in question can ask for." Thank you.
Let me start with, I have a long list of questions. I'm sure we all do. Just to raise, and I just one comment about sort of intersections is, Mel starts by talking about difficulties with the documentary, history right now, and what, raising important questions about what questions we can actually answer in the near term and what ones we can't. And then Peter began his remarks by basically saying that the central reason for many of the mistakes during the Iraq War were because of an inadequate understanding of history. So if we can't really get a handle on it very quickly, then how can the recent history inform our path going forward? But let me ask a question about the role of law in this, and I'm thinking about this in relation to Mel's focus on the U.S., but really for anyone. In one of the interesting memoirs from this period, Jack Goldsmith, I think this goes to the question that Mel raises about why decision making was so flawed, and I wonder whether we should put some of that at the feet of the lawyers, at least in some areas. And so there's an argument that Jack Goldsmith, who was for a limited period of time head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Bush administration, basically Bush's lawyer. When policy issues would come up, the OLC advises the president about what the legal parameters are, what can be done, what can't be done within the terms of the law. And what Goldsmith said in his book, The Terror Presidency, is that there was so much fear about another attack, that it would happen, and that they would be blamed for it. That would be all their fault because it happened on their watch. That they felt that they had to go, as far as they could with anything. And so if they were going to, if there was going to be an answer that no, the president couldn't do something, there had to be a really good reason. And a reason that it violated the law, especially the criminal law, was a reason that would count, right? And he said that's why we went to the edges of the law. And he basically describes, as have others, this sort of extreme version of what the legal boundaries as the decisional sort of factor, basically expanded to the edges of the law, sort of pushing the policy options, in the direction of the sort of extreme edges of legality. And what Goldsmith and some others, like Philip Zakalo of the 9/11 Commission, have argued is that essentially when this happened, legal answers became the answers, displacing other kinds of judgment. And certainly this applies in the context of torture policy and Guantanamo and detention generally. But we also see law playing such an important role in military strategy and decision-making, the law of armed conflict, what's called operational law, the law that governs what soldiers can and cannot do on the battlefield. And so I wonder whether there's sort of a broader point to make, drawing from this idea that law plays this role in this era. That, now you look at the operational law manuals and they're huge, and it's out of this understanding of law that we get the rules of engagement, and that soldiers are going to follow in a particular operation. So is part of the answer possibly at least something to look at for how we end up with a sort of a poverty of really critical analysis that the legal parameters, sort of setting the boundaries, sort of vacuums out other forms of judgment, like what's in the U.S. strategic interest, what's in our foreign policy interest, what's moral, what serves our long-term interests as a country. So I just wonder whether any of you have thoughts about that.
Well, I think Goldsmith's book, The Terror Presidency, is a wonderful book to read. It provides a lot of insight, and his overriding theme inheres in the title of the book, Terror Presidency, and that is to say that policymakers, at least in the initial stages, in the months or year or so after 9/11, were hugely inspired and motivated by their fear of another attack. And some of the key legal decisions, Goldsmith argues, were made precisely in those months, and especially really the 6 months after 9/11. Some of the most important decisions about how to deal with detainees and alleged terrorists, et cetera, and establishing Guantanamo and all those things. The interesting thing, of course, is that when Goldsmith is not a key player in 2001 and early 2002, and when he becomes a key player, he actually begins to change the configuration of the debate amongst the policymakers and modulates some of the procedures and interpretations that already had been approved. I think that's important because it illuminates something that he does not stress, and that is that the atmosphere of fear actually modulates somewhat as time goes on. And so it's a very interesting interpretive question about the role of fear in all of this, because just as some of the most important legal procedures were implemented in the weeks and months immediately after 9/11, so too the planning for the war in Iraq, the serious planning for the war in Iraq, begins in November and especially December of 2001, when levels of fear of another attack are extremely high. Nonetheless, that planning actually becomes more intense in the summer and fall of 2002, when the actual fears of another attack inside the United States have become somewhat, just somewhat, modulated. But by this time, the mobilization and deployments for war are designed as I intimated in my remarks, to practice coercive diplomacy. As this is happening, of course, the policymakers become more and more committed to this and believe that their own credibility is vested in the practice of coercive diplomacy. And that credibility then becomes coupled with fear, as well as with their own notions of guilt about having been in office on 9/11, to shape the decision to go to war, and also to influence the overall legal contours of the operation of the war. So I think if you're looking for one of the really good memoirs about the aftermath of 9/11, actually Goldsmith's book is a very thoughtful book, because he's actually a conservative supporter of most of the things that went on, and believes that there was reason to be fearful, but at the same time believes that the types of legal precedents that should have been set were hugely distorted by the fear that, however justifiable, led to really inappropriate and ultimately counter-effective policies.
I'd like to dovetail onto that and talk about the Bush administration in terms of its competency to battle terrorism in 2001. We forget now that Bush entered office to become the education president. And as far as military policy was concerned, his platform was that superpowers don't do nation building, and we needed to get out of the Balkans, a lighter, more rapidly deployable, more high-tech military that would fight conventional wars, and that we would be an offshore balancer. So his administration was nearly completely unprepared for something like 9/11, not just in terms of defending the nation against it, but in reacting to it. There was a sense, I think, in the Bush administration that battling terror requires intelligence, and that's true, it does. But their assumption was that normal intelligence procedures were not sufficient to gather the needed intel to fight Al-Qaeda effectively. The investigation into 9/11 had not yet been published. I think that investigation definitively showed that, in fact, normal intelligence procedures could have provided the information we needed. We just ignored the signs. And there was a stovepiping of intelligence in different agencies that prevented all the various loose ends from being linked together. But nevertheless, the administration felt that they needed better tools to fight Al-Qaeda. This was a different kind of terrorist organization, globally based, linked via cyberspace, very difficult to get at, and therefore they started to intrude on the edges of legality and in some cases step over them in order to get what they felt were the needed tools to fight Al-Qaeda. And some of those policies I agreed with, and some I did not agree with, particularly the use of torture, waterboarding. There's another aspect of the question Mary raised, though, and that goes to what we know about the deliberations of the Bush administration. What we really need are the notes of the National Security Council meetings.
There may not be.
Well, there are for 2006 to 2008, because we took them and we stored them in General Petraeus' papers, and they're at NDU, and it may take a long time before they become declassified. But we need them for the first, so we have them for the last 2 years of the administration, but we need them for the first 6 years, especially the period between 2001 and 2003. And this is a real shortcoming in our government. In fact, I think our government Congress should actually pass a law that says NSC meetings notes must be kept and archived. The sort of notes that are kept in the British government, for instance, you can see all the time and are released every 30 years. We don't do that. And so a lot of US decision making is behind closed doors. It only leaks out via self-serving memoirs. I mean, you read Rumsfeld's memoirs, for instance, and you get the sense that he wasn't responsible for any of the bad things that happened under his watch. It was always someone else's fault. It's really terrible. Anyway, regarding the National Security Council and the Bush handling of it, looking back on strategic decision making, the more, and I think I said this in my paper, the more discussion, the better. I just did a chapter in a book on U.S. grand strategy in World War II, and it became very apparent to me that one of the reasons Allied, the coalition, the Grand Alliance strategy came out so well is there were severe debates, almost to the point where the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Ernest J. King, was going to launch over the table at his British counterpart in one conference. He was so mad at him. But what these debates did, as angry as they were, is they forced people to defend their positions, to defend the assumptions behind their positions, to really argue forcefully for what was the right strategy. Those debates did not happen in the first 6 years of the Bush administration. That's my belief. President Bush was very much a consensus builder. He valued consensus above all else, and he was loyal to his subordinates beyond default. Otherwise, he would have fired Rumsfeld after Abu Ghraib. And so this lack of discussion in the Bush administration really led to these sort of strategic decisions that we shake our head at today. And in fact, President Bush in his own memoirs, Decision Points, one of the reasons I like his memoirs, he says in regards to the decision to de-Ba'athify Iraqi society and to disband the Iraqi army, he goes, you know, in retrospect, we did not have a vigorous discussion about these Ambassador Bremer's decisions in the National Security Council, and we should have. And we might have come to the same conclusion, but at least we would have done what we did with a better idea of the second and third order effects of these decisions. And so I think President Bush grew in office. Unfortunately, he grew too slowly. But by the end of his tenure, of his second presidency, I think at any rate, he had an idea of how to make good strategy, and it was nowhere near to what it was when he entered office.
I just want to draw attention, I mean, this discussion of law and the limits of law is focused primarily on the American scene, but there has been and is an emerging discussion now on the international, the significance of the way sanctions were deployed in Iraq and continue to deploy now for Syria and for Iran, and how they fit in the changing international legal system. And so Joy Gordon, who I mentioned before, among others, is looking at the meaning of this and has raised the question, particularly in the case of the Iraq embargo, whether in fact the impact of the embargo raises the issue of this is a crime against a war crime, really, against a population that becomes extremely threatened. How do we deal? And it's done in the name of the UN. And so she's raised this issue of the need to look at the limits that these sanctions and the way they've been deployed after 1990 on an international level in the name of the UN and the community of nations, and what it means to the whole international legal order.
Thank you. It's a very interesting panel. And I'm Johanna Bachman at George Mason University. And the thing I think it's problematic for the focus on the American role because I think even from a historical perspective, the current colonial history does not focus on the colonial power solely, but sees that colonialism is a creation among the colony and the colonizer, but also that the lack of the colonial history has moved beyond diplomatic history, and so if we take general current day notions of colonial history as maybe a direction to see that the Iraq war history is about Iraqis and Americans going to war together, like it's a communal war. It wasn't just the Americans creating a war on these people, it's a collective experience. So it seems to me, how can we reconcile the focus on American diplomatic decisions and sort of what Dina's taking us in a direction of thinking about what is the Iraqi experience in a variety of possibilities, soldiers, diplomats, everyday people. How can we reconcile those two directions and to create a more complex Iraq war history? That's my question.
Well, I think that's a good question. I think I would probably disagree with you. I think in many respects, the decision to go to war was an American decision, and it's not a diplomatic decision. It's a war-making decision. It's the highest type of policy decision. It has to deal with the actual renunciation of diplomacy and the decision to use war. I think that's the critical variable here. So, but I do think that some of the issues that inhere in your question are extremely important, and they're very much implied in Dina's really terrific paper, I thought. So I would reframe your question in this way in order to answer your good question, and to reframe it for Dina to answer, not for me. But to what extent should policymakers in the United States have understood the subtleties of developments that were going on in Iraq in the 1990s, 2000, 2001, and 2002, that in retrospect you can illuminate, but that probably, and that's my question, were not really highlighted at the time. So to what extent should officials have known the very things that you talked about? To what extent could they have known the very things you talked about?
So let me try to answer this two ways, because there are two sort of questions there. Could they have known? Of course they could. There's no doubt in my mind they're good. I mean, you're talking about this collection of information and the debates at the highest level, but the State Department had a 1,200 page report before going into war that was presented by a number of Iraqi exiles that are of a different genre than and political.
But interesting, they're the very exiles that you criticize in your paper for providing incorrect information about what was happening. So the very exiles who helped contribute to these reports were the ones who you critique in your paper for having misinformation about the circumstances in Iraq.
I mean, we're talking about two kinds of exiles. The people who helped write the report it's a much more complex group of people. So there were lawyers who, for example, and physicians who had maintained contact with Iraq and presented a more complex vision of Iraq and Iraq in the 90s. But could they have known? I think there were people in and out of Iraq in the 90s that could have been talked to. I think the interlocutors that they've chosen to talk to before going into Iraq, whether we're talking about the Iraq National Council or other opposition groups, had a very, very, very limited vision of what was going on the ground. Or if they did know, they chose to sort of erase the realities in their projection. They wanted U.S. intervention and help, and the only way you can mobilize this is to say it's relatively easy, and these people are dying to be liberated from Saddam Hussein, and they're going to welcome you. I mean, so this is a political decision, and it speaks a little bit to Johanna's question, which is you need to see this not as an American decision also, but also as a decision where Iraqis are within the opposition that are embedded in Iraqi politics of the last 20, 30 years, and exile politics in 20, 30 years contributed to this decision. So in that sense, this is how we need to talk about this, at least even at the highest levels of diplomatic, writing about this diplomatically. They also could have known about the basis, the realities of Iraq that are things that they needed to know at a very basic level, and I think they neglected to appreciate. You cannot bring an Iraqi opposition, a Shia Islamist Iraqi opposition, who spent 8 years of its life fighting against Iraqis in an Iran-Iraq war that had 600,000 people dead, that caused 600,000 Iraqi dead. I mean, this is sort of a counter. What they've done was quite problematic, and these people ultimately now are in power, many of them, in Iraq, engaged in very dubious, undemocratic practiced torture on Iraqi prisoners of war, and so on. So all of these factors in, and was accessible in the 90s. This was information that was accessible by exiles in the 90s, including Shia exiles, so that they could have known and should have known. But I think what we need, if we want to talk about the history of the Iraq war, is talk about, and perhaps because it's not history, we are unable to disentangle the presentness of it and its implication for the American political system. We need to work in communities and forums to write this history, not as a history of a war that has gone awry and has created a certain culture. It has, but also as a history where there were continuous engagements between Iraqis on the ground and the American forces on the ground, and how this worked together. I have to say that sitting out here and being very angry as the war against Iraq was being planned and waged and eventually even with the counterinsurgency, there was tremendous anger. But you talk to Iraqis or sections of the Iraqi population directly after the occupation, the first 1.5 years of the occupation. They didn't like what had taken place, but they were willing to work with the system. And they saw this as hegemonic enterprise, but they said, let's work with it. We don't hear what happened to them, why they were disenfranchised, they were out, why their voices have disappeared. So, when we talk about the war, it has to be an enterprise that takes place with people who study Iraq, but also Iraqis who experienced it over there. And there are lots of historians who work on this in Iraq.
Well, we have some documents that allow us to get at the Iraqi perspective, but we need more. The Harmony database, which Melvyn called by another name, which is stored at, I think, NDU, is a collection of captured documents of the Saddam Hussein government. A lot of these have been analyzed and published in the Iraqi Perspectives Project, which gives the perspective of the Saddam's government leading up to the war in Iraq and why he thought we would never invade, which is fascinating going to his mindset. There's a document called The Insurgency in Their Own Words, which is a collection of what the insurgents have said about themselves. So we can get at a little bit of what the insurgency was all about. We still need a lot more. We need more experience of the Iraqi people. It would be subaltern studies in colonial history, I suppose. Some of that's coming out, but we need a lot more. But the language barrier is formidable. Collecting those sort of stories or finding Iraqis who are going to publish those sorts of books and articles, it's very difficult. We need documents of the Iraqi government after it regained sovereignty on June 28, 2004. And those are veiled in a cloud of secrecy. We see how hard it is to get the documents of our own government. Getting the Iraqi government's documents equally difficult if they even exist. And finally, maybe not even finally, but additionally, we need the Iranian perspective. And that is going to be decades away. But Iran had a huge impact on what happened in Iraq. And the machinations of the Quds Force under Qasem Soleimani, that sort of history, we may never have it. But it's going to take a regime change probably in Tehran before we do. So lots of grist for the mill for future historians if they can get their hands on the stuff.
I see 3 people, and so what we can do, go ahead. And what I'm going to suggest is if you want to go next after him, and then you. So please state your name.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dick Jolene, and I'm simply a guest. But I've heard some buzzwords here that are a little troubling. They start with sanctions, coercive diplomacy, weapons of mass destruction, and then policies and actions that followed with regard to Iraq. And now we've just heard the word Iran. And suddenly I'm connecting dots from the earlier lecture we heard. So the value of history is take it from the past and try to look at it and how it may apply to the present. And when we look at those same words, suddenly I'm hearing those same words in the current Iranian situation. We're in the middle of, some course of diplomacy. Sanctions are being leveled. We have, and the concept of weapons of mass destruction, which appeared somewhat nebulous or doubtful perhaps in the Iraqi situation, seems to be a little different in the Iranian situation. So I'd like to ask your opinions on how you view the Iraqi experience when the topic here is, does the Iraqi war continue? Well, also we can extend that to say, what do we learn from the Iraqi experience in terms of contemporary situation? Thank you.
Well, we're sort of branching out from history to political science here. I would say, and I do say in my book on the surge, that if we learn nothing else from the Iraq War, we need to learn that when the iron dice roll, unpredictable things can and will happen. So you have to not just understand operationally what you can do to, say, destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities, should it come down to that, but what is the aftermath of such an action? And most famously, how does it all end? And unless you think through how the war is going to end, then it's problematical whether you should begin it in the first place. And I think the history of the Iraq War is pretty instructive in this regard. We didn't think through the end game, if you will. We knew we had the capability to conduct a regime change in Iraq, but we thought everything would just sort of fall in place after that, and it didn't. That other people have votes, and that unpredictable things such as the formation of an insurgency can and will happen. And these are the sorts of things that I hope the Obama administration is looking at as it looks towards future policy, current and future policy regarding the Iranian regime. Having said that, that doesn't mean you should never go to war, because there are valid reasons for going to war, but it should not be the policy of first resort.
Well, my short answer to your question is that the lessons of Iraq for Iran is that the U.S. should be chastened by the experience and should be very wary of using military weaponry to try to deal with weapons of mass destruction, although clearly there's no contemplation of of the deployment of large numbers of military troops, as there was, in the case of Iraq. But I would agree very much that the lesson is a very simple one. Be very wary about using military capabilities when you can't predict the consequences. In addition, you might also think about, look at history and think about other examples when nations have developed weapons of mass destruction and what have been the consequences of it. So what I always talk to my students about when they raise this issue is that no regime ever seemed more worrisome and incoherent than the Chinese regime in the early and mid-1960s when it developed weapons of mass destruction. And there were, at the time, very extensive discussions about using preemptive military force. Indeed, the Soviet Union was thinking of using preemptive military force and actually approached the United States to discuss the possibility of joint initiatives to thwart the Chinese development of weapons of mass destruction. But the decision was not to do so. And I think it helps us to place in context the issue of, just how worrisome would it be if Iran got weapons of mass destruction? Yes, it makes sense to want to prevent it, but when you do the costs and benefits of using military action, it's important to keep previous examples in mind.
I'll just add a word or two on sanctions. I mean, the deployment of sanctions as a weapon of coercive diplomacy, and I'm not sure if that's the characterization of what sanctions are now in diplomatic statements. It seems to me it has not worked either for Iraq, where intervention was necessary. I suspect it won't work for Iran. So that creates a host of questions for us on when to deploy sanctions, and then the human costs of sanctions on populations that suffer the consequences of these sanctions. And it's not regimes suffer, but they rework their politics and their deployment of resources in ways that preserve them in power, but the populations ultimately suffer.
I'm Arbella Bichling, Harvard University. My question is, I fear that somebody could come away from this discussion with the impression that the mistakes leading up to the invasion and during the invasion were somehow apolitical. In other words, that the debate is between, was the trumping up of the threat of WMDs somehow, contingent on political motivations, or, golly gee gosh shucks, they just got it wrong. Somehow they were trying to get it right and they just got it wrong. It had nothing to do with politics, and it was just a kind of attempt to, protect the United States from another attack. And the reason why I think this needs to be clarified is because incompetence, it seems to me, is historically and politically contingent. There are WMDs everywhere, there are dictators everywhere. The focus on Iraq is historically and politically contingent. I don't think that that's what you're saying. I don't think you're saying that this was an apolitical series of mistakes, but this is something that I think needs to be very explicitly clarified and fleshed out, so I would appreciate if you could comment on that. Thank you.
I don't think it was apolitical at all. I have a forthcoming article in the journal called Diplomatic History that discusses the foreign policies of the Bush administration, mostly in relationship to this decision to go to war. And I sort of play around with or focus on three interpretive variables, and one is fear, and another is guilt. Guilt in the sense of having been in office at 9/11, when policymakers, as Professor Mansoor has pointed out here, were actually adequately warned about the prospect of a terrorist attack, and ultimately did very little about it. Not to say that they could have prevented it, but what's important in understanding what they do after 9/11 is the realization that they knew they had been warned, and they also knew they had done very little to deal with the situation. That's one of the factors that bears upon the way they proceed after 9/11 and why they are so eager to link dots together. But also the preoccupation with guilt is actually related to the most political of all things, and that is to say that it is very clear that policymakers felt that if there were another attack of any sort, they would be politically discredited, and they worried mightily about how the American people would react if there were another terrorist attack on their watch. So to a significant extent, how significant I think serious people can debate, but to a significant extent, the eagerness to thwart another attack of whatever sort was related to their fear of political humiliation if that did not happen. Now, it wasn't just political humiliation. These are people who take their responsibility to protect the American people seriously, and they knew they had not successfully done their principal overriding task. That was a significant weight on them, and if you open Condoleezza Rice's memoir and just read the introductory pages, you will see the degree to which this sense of guilt and preoccupation weighs on her every single day. And it bears upon her concept of what would be the prudent things to do in the future, given the consequences of the past, including the political consequences.
Could I actually interject something? Because I'd like to restate Arabella's question for Mel, and then go on to a broader discussion if it's okay, because I could just imagine that she might be thinking that, well, if, say, Bill Clinton had been in office, could those categories, which you so powerfully argue in a way that's convincing, were present. Fear, guilt, and the concern about being politically discredited. What's not in that account, and that I thought was part of what she was asking, was more about political ideology. More about someone's substantive political vision. And so if you could just revisit that part of the question, whether something about one's, the administration's substantive political ideology and vision was in play, or was it really these kinds of factors that might have been present no matter what group was in office?
I'll take a swing at it. The Bush administration had a real belief in the efficacy and use of American military power to achieve the goals of its foreign policy. And it was this belief, I think, that drove it to an overuse of the military instrument of power. There are a lot of factors that go into creating strategy. Domestic politics is just one of them. I think we should avoid going to the extreme of saying domestic politics is the driver of strategy. Just because Karl Rove says the Iraq War can work to our advantage in the 2004 elections does not mean that's the reason they went to war in Iraq. He's just making a political point. In 2006, the Republicans got trounced at the ballot box and lost control of both houses of Congress. Did that have an impact on the surge strategy? Absolutely. But it wasn't the reason the surge strategy was implemented. It did have a direct impact in the firing of Donald Rumsfeld. So, I would just be careful. Yes, these sorts of influences of domestic politics, neocon vision of the world and so forth, have an influence. But are they the primary drivers of strategy? That's still something that we have to sort out. I think George Packer has actually done a pretty good job in The Assassin's Gate of taking the first shot at it, the influence of neocon ideology on the Iraq War. But I think there's much more to be written. And unfortunately, some of the real important people in this regard, Cheney, Rumsfeld, have written, again, very self-serving memoirs, and I'm not sure they kept good notes because they want the historical record to, they want to be Winston Churchill. The historical record will be kind to me because I intend to write it. So, I don't know if we'll ever get down to the nuts and bolts, but we'll see.
Well, I disagree with several of the things that were just said. First of all, I don't think the Bush administration, and I certainly don't think President Bush, came to power in January of 2001, eager to use American military force. Nor do I think that many of the other people around him were eager to use military force. In this context, I think 9/11 has a transformative impact. If, with regard to Mary's reconfiguration of the question about political ideology and whether a Clinton administration, if I understood you correctly, would a Clinton administration have done this? Well, there's just been a really interesting book published. I think his last name is Harvey, and his first name may be Michael Harvey. He's a Canadian political scientist, in which the whole book, about 300-page careful analysis, is about it's a counterfactual analysis and asks the question, what if President Gore was there in 2001 and 2002 and 2003? And the gist of the analysis is that ultimately the United States would have gone to war, and that it would not have made us a significant difference.
With Iraq as well.
It gone to war in Iraq.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And it's worth reading it. I mean, if you read Al Gore's speeches, for example, after 9/11, in the fall of 2001 and 2002, you'll see, in fact, he gives a speech right after Bush's Axis of Evil speech, and he says to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, he said, yes, I think it's a good thing to call evil by its very name. I think Iraq is a very special regime, and we really need to deal with it. And Joe Biden says it in January, February 2002 in congressional hearings, et cetera, et cetera. So, but more broadly, you know, what is the role of political ideology and the neocons? I think that there are huge misconceptions about that. First of all, Dick Cheney was not a neocon. Donald Rumsfeld was not a neocon. George Bush was not a neocon. Condi Rice was not a neocon. So what do we really mean when we say neocons? Nor do I think the documents show that that notions of democracy promotion were in any way critical to the decision to go to war. Subsequently, once the decision to go to war occurred, the notion of promoting democracy, however vague, began to function more effectively in the actual operational processes within the CPA and elsewhere. But if you look carefully at the documents that so far exist, promoting democracy in Iraq is not a preoccupation of policymakers, is not a preoccupation of policymakers. Regime change, yes, but regime change didn't mean promoting democracy. And for example, in the famous letter that is cited in, what's the book, the Assassin's Gate, he harps upon it in his book. Every writer sort of talks about the book, the letter to President Clinton in 1998 by a group of mostly neocons like Paul Wolfowitz. And if you read that letter carefully, saying that, yes, you really need to go to war to get, you really need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They didn't say go to war, but you really need to get Saddam Hussein. You'll notice in that letter, if you read it, that there is not a single allusion to promoting democracy in Iraq. It's all about security issues, weapons of mass destruction, the possibility of Saddam getting weapons and therefore blackmailing the United States, all sorts of issues of that sort. So I say this, Mary, because I think that we assign notion of neocon political ideology and a desire to democratize the Middle East as a key motivating factor, and I think that factor is fundamentally wrong in terms of motivating the decision to go to war.
I have a question for Melvyn, and I'm wondering if you can, I'm not a foreign relations historian, I'm basically a social and cultural historian, so excuse my sort of way of framing it, but I'm wondering if we can't see the Iraq War as sort of ways of as part of this order that emerges after the Cold War, as 1990 to 2003, and ways of dealing with the world, and particularly states that seem to be problematic. I mean, we have to remember that under the Clinton administration, we had surgical strikes, not only in Iraq, in Sudan, in Somalia, and everywhere. So what makes 2003 different, and what is the logic behind it? And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm very interested in the fact that you use emotion and the role of emotion, terror, guilt, and so on, as central in creating sort of an atmosphere or central to decision-making processes. But I'm wondering to what extent 9/11 itself becomes a signpost, an ideological construct to justify American foreign policy, and to what extent do the memoirs that are written about, 5, sometimes 10 years later, are partaking of this transformation of 9/11 as this tremendous break that justifies, I mean, as part of an ideological construct. It's not neocons only, it's 9/11 becomes a justification in and of itself. I mean, because there's quite a bit of fluidity right after 9/11 in the public discourse of its meaning.
Correct.
So,
Correct. 9/11 is a transformative moment. I agree with that. I don't think that policy before 9/11 is continuous, either under the Clinton years or in the first 10 months of the Bush administration. 9/11 is a transformative moment. I think everyone thinks so at the time. I don't think it's just something that's written 8 or 10 years later when people write memoirs. It's pretty clear in the evidence that we have that what you say is exactly right. And why is it so? It's not just an intellectual construct. People who are charged with the responsibility of protecting the United States take it seriously. The United States was attacked. 4,000 people were killed. That hadn't, happened. There had been no attack before. It relates to America's own sense of privileged security in the global arena, but that very sense of being, in a sense, having a privileged place in the global arena where security is more or less assured, is obliterated by 9/11. And so the short answer to your question is 9/11 is a transformative moment.
I'd like to make one tiny point and then ask a question of Dina. And the tiny point is that, as important as the question, Mel, that you're reacting to about sort of neocons and the decision to go to war, and the issue whether that's motivated in part by democratization. So as important as that issue is, it's not the only issue relevant to Arabella's question about whether politics and political ideology inform the broader structure of decision-making with regard to Iraq. So I would just say, thinking about the way the panel, you all framed your remarks at the beginning in terms of thinking about research and where to go, I think that even assuming that Mel nails that question, there's still other questions to ask about how politics and ideology affected American decision-making and global alliances. But I had a question for Dina, and that's that when you put the Iraq War in a broader global context, as you just did, broader global context in terms of American military action, it really sort of goes to a question that I've had about this whole moment, and that's whether we're seeing a state structure in a sense that when we look at the United States and the forms of projection of American military power, so that colonialism as a model just doesn't, it's sort of run out of explanatory power. And whether we have a need for a different analytical category. I mean, because, if you think about, I think that plans were underway to establish AFRICOM before 9/11, Peter, weren't they? So that now we have American military commands governing the entire globe, and we also have military capabilities to go places and do things without even sending American personnel there, right? So there's the technological component and robotic warfare. And then the relationship between the U.S. and allies in getting folks on board as the coalition forces in Iraq and elsewhere, so that I think all of these things undermine the utility, arguably, of colonialism as a model. And so I just was wondering what you think about that.
Yes, I think you're right, but colonialism, if you're talking about colonialism in the sort of 19th century sense or the early 20th century sense, this is a totally different ballgame. But I think for populations that deal with the impact of this transformation in international power, and particularly for me, because I'm a historian ultimately of war, the deployment of these technologies of violence that make it impossible to fight on the same kind of grounds that were more or less equal, more equal actually, I would say, in the anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 60s. This is a totally new ballgame, but it's a ballgame that has to be articulated in tremendous disparities of power, global power, and I think the old models need to be reconsidered, reworked. But when we talk about decolonization, what are we talking about now, where post-colonial states are disintegrating, and part of the process is supported by peoples who can't, I mean, in the case of Syria, for example, you have an opposition that's obviously saying we need, or parts of the opposition, we need American intervention. What does that mean? And so certainly models have to be reworked, but in terms of unequal distribution of power, there has to be some sort of explanation.
We're just about at the end of our time, so if each one member of the panel wants to offer concluding remarks.
I'll go last.
I don't have anything final to say.
I think I had my last word. I wanted to mention Abdurrahman Munif and Gertrude Bell, and I managed to get them on, so I don't think I'll add to that.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Well, I would like to thank you all for participating in this conversation with us. Let's thank our panelists.